How I Raised Myself from Failure to Success in Selling by Frank Bedker. Chapter 12. How I Find the Hidden Objection. I kept a record one time of more than 5,000 interviews to try and find out why people bought or failed to buy. In 62% of the cases, the original objection raised against buying was not the real reason at all. I found that only 38% of the time did the prospect give me the real reason for not buying. Why is that? Why will people, substantial people, perfectly honest in every other way, mislead and misrepresent facts to salespeople? That's something it took me a long time to understand. The late J. Pierpont Morgan, Sr., one of the shrewdest men in all of history, once said, "A man generally has two reasons for doing a thing, one that sounds good and a real one." Keeping those records for several years certainly proved to me the truth of this statement. So I began experimenting to find some way that I might determine whether the reason given was real or merely one that sounded good. Eventually, I hit on a simple little phrase that produced surprising results and which has literally been worth thousands of dollars to me. It's a common everyday phrase. That's why it's good. The phrase is, "in addition to that." Let me illustrate how I use it. For several years, I'd been trying to sell business insurance to a large carpet manufacturing concern that was owned and managed by 3 men. 2 of them were in favor of the idea, but the third was opposed. He was old and partly deaf. Every time I talked to him about the matter, his hearing took a sudden turn for the worse, and he couldn't understand a word I said. While eating breakfast one morning, I read an announcement in the newspaper of his sudden death. Naturally, my first thought after reading the announcement was, "Now I've got a sure sale." Several days later, I phoned the president of the company and made an appointment. I had previously done considerable business with him. When I arrived at the mill, I was ushered into his office, and I noticed he didn't seem quite so pleasant as usual. I sat down. He looked at me. I looked at him. Finally, he said, "I guess you're up here to talk to us about that business insurance, aren't you?" I just grinned, a big broad grin. He didn't smile back one bit. "Well," he said, "we're not going to do anything about it." "Would you mind telling me why, Bob?" "Because," he explained, "we're losing money. We're in the red and have been all year. To take out that insurance would cost us about $8,000 or $10,000 a year, wouldn't it?" "Yes," I agreed. "Well, we've made up our minds," he went on, "not to spend any more money than we absolutely must until we see how long this is going to last." After a few moments of silence, I said, "Bob, in addition to that, isn't there something else in the back of your mind? Isn't there some other reason that makes you hesitate to go on with this plan?" Bob, a little smile beginning to play around his mouth, said, "Well, yes, there is something else on my mind." Me, "Would you mind telling me what that is?" Bob, "It's those 2 boys of mine. They finished college and are in here working now. They are up in the mill working in overalls every day from 8 to 5, and they love it. You don't think I'd be fool enough to go into a plan that will sell out my interest in this business if I die, do you? Where would that leave my boys? They'd be kicked out. Isn't that right?" There it was. The first objection was just one that sounded good. Now I knew the real reason. I had a chance. I was able to point out that it was even more important for him to do something now. We worked out a plan which included his sons, a plan which made their situation absolutely secure regardless of who died first and when. That sale alone was worth $3,860 to me. Now, why did I ask this man that question? Because I doubted his word? No, not at all. His first objection was so logical and real, I had no reason to doubt his word. In fact, I believed it. But years of experience had taught me the odds were 2 to 1 that something else was in the picture. My records proved it. So it became habitual with me to ask this question anyhow, just as a routine checkup. I don't recall ever once having anyone resent my asking it. When the objection given proves to be the real reason, what do? Let me give one example. I was having lunch one day at the Union League in Philadelphia with two friends of mine, Neil McNeil, that's interesting, Neil McNeil Jr., sales manager of Sandoz Chemical Company, Philadelphia, and Frank R. Davis, Philadelphia real estate broker. Neil said, "Frank and I have got a real prospect for you. Don Lindsay was talking to us yesterday about buying some insurance. He's making a lot of money, and you ought to be able to sell him about 50 or 100,000. Isn't that right, Frank?" Frank Davis seemed very enthusiastic about the prospect. He advised me to get right out there the next morning, and he said, "Be sure to tell Don that Neil and I sent you." 10 o'clock the next morning, I walked into Mr. Lindsay's plant at 54th Street and Paschal Avenue in Philadelphia. He manufactures electric fixtures. I told his secretary that Mr. McNeil and Mr. Davis sent me out here to see Mr. Lindsay. As I was ushered into his office, he was standing in one corner with an expression on his face that reminded me of Jack Dempsey's scowl just before the opening gong. I waited, but he wasn't talking. So I said, "Mr. Lindsay, Neil McNeil and Frank Davis sent me out to see you. They said you're about to buy some life insurance." "What the bleep is this?" shouted Lindsay in a voice that must have been heard out on Paschal Avenue. "You're the fifth insurance man they've sent out here in 2 days. Is this what they call a funny joke?" Well, was I surprised? I would have burst out in a big laugh, but this fellow really had fire in his eyes. Finally, I said, "What did you say to Neil and Frank that made them think you were going to buy life insurance?" Still shouting, "I told them that I'd never bought any life insurance in my life. I don't believe in life insurance." "You've been a very successful businessman, Mr. Lindsay," I said. "You must have a good reason for not buying life insurance. Would you mind telling me why?" "Sure, I'll tell you why." His voice toned down quite a bit. "I've got all the money I need, and if anything happens to me, my wife and daughters will have all the money they need." I paused as I thought about what he said. Then, "Mr. Lindsay, in addition to that, isn't there some other reason why you've never bought life insurance?" "No, that's the only thing. Isn't that a good enough reason?" "Oh, may I ask you a personal question?" He said, "Go ahead." "Me, do you owe any money?" He said, I don't owe a dollar in the world." "Me, if you did owe considerable money, would you consider buying life insurance to wipe out the loan at your death?" "I might," he said. "Has it occurred to you that if you should die tonight, automatically, there would be a big mortgage placed against your estate by Uncle Sam, and before your wife and daughters could get a cent, they would have to raise cash to pay off that mortgage?" Mr. Lindsay bought the first insurance that day that he'd ever bought in his life. The next day, I saw McNeil and Davis at lunch. When I told them Lindsay had bought, I never saw two men look more surprised. For a while, they wouldn't believe it. But when they realized I wasn't joking, they seemed to get a great kick out of that. In addition to that, isn't there something else in the back of your mind? Often requires a little additional urging for the other person to open up and talk. Let me illustrate with an unusual experience. In Orlando, Florida, one morning, a young salesman came to me at the hotel with a serious problem. About 2 years previously, his company, a New York chemical concern, had mysteriously lost their largest account in Florida and never were able to find out why they had lost it. They tried everything to regain the business. One of their vice presidents had come down from New York, but even he had failed to get anywhere. "When I came with the company 1 year ago," this promising-looking salesman explained, "they impressed on me the importance of going after that business until I got it back. I've called on those people regularly now for a year, and to me, it looks hopeless." I asked him several questions about his interviews with them, particularly his recent interviews. "Just this morning," he said, "I was there again. I talked with the president, Mr. Jones, but it was the same thing. He wouldn't talk. He just sat there, looking bored. After I stopped talking, there was a long silence, and finally I got up in embarrassment and left." I suggested that he go right back again that afternoon and tell Mr. Jones he had just received word from the head office to go back at once. The salesman and I talked over exactly what he was to say. Then I had him repeat it back to me. Late that afternoon, he telephoned me and was so excited he could hardly speak. He said, May I come right over to see you? I've got an order from Mr. Jones, and I believe the whole trouble is being straightened out. Our Atlanta manager is flying down here tonight." It seemed incredible. I guess I was almost as excited about it as he was. I said, "Come on right over and tell me about it." "Here's the interview," he related. It all seems so simple I can hardly believe it. As I walked into Mr. Jones' office, he looked up with surprise. Salesman: "Mr. Jones, since I saw you this morning, I received word from our head office in New York to see you at once and get all the facts. Exactly why we lost your business. Our company is sure you must have a good reason. Someone in our organization must have blundered somehow. Won't you please tell me what it was, Mr. Jones?" Jones: "I've told you before. I decided to give another concern a trial. They have proved to be perfectly satisfactory, and I wouldn't consider changing." Salesman: "If there was something else, and you tell me what it is, and we can't clear it up, you'll feel better for having given us the chance. If we're able to prove beyond any question of doubt in your mind that it was an unintentional mistake or oversight, you'll feel better for giving us a chance to correct the wrong. Isn't that right, Mr. Jones?" Parenthetical, same old thing. Mr. Jones just sat there looking out the window, but this time I kept quiet and waited him out. It seemed awfully long, but finally he began to talk. "Well, if you want to know, your company discontinued a special discount without notifying us. As soon as I discovered it, I cut them off." There was the real reason. Here's what happened. That alert young salesman lost no time. He thanked Mr. Jones gratefully for the information and immediately hurried to the nearest public telephone and called the Atlanta office. They got out their records and then called the New York office. Comparison of records proved Mr. Jones had good reason to believe his discount had been discontinued, although it really had not. The salesman was instructed to return immediately to Jones's office. By the time he reached there, Jones had been convinced over the phone of the true facts. The Atlanta manager took entire blame for this failure to properly notify Mr. Jones of a new method of billing on a net basis. I hesitated a long while before deciding to make this little formula public. I was afraid it might be regarded as a trick, and I don't believe in tricks. I can't use them. They don't work. I've tried them. And I'm glad they failed, because in the long run, I know that tricks are a losing game of any business. Nothing will take the place of complete honesty, first, last, and all of the time. Summed up. Remember these wise words of J. Pierpont Morgan. A man generally has two reasons for doing a thing, one that sounds good and a real one. The best formula I ever found to draw out the real one is built around these two little questions. Why? And in addition to that.